we're going to be talking about equity and accessibility. Also, we'll just touch on kind of accommodations. It is the law, so again, we want to be in compliance with the law and make sure that our virtual classrooms are accessible to all learners. And then part two, we'll talk about differentiating instruction according to proficiency levels in our classroom. There's also been some buzz about badges, which I'm really excited about. So again, I mentioned the reimaging of the role of technology in education, and just to kind of summarize the legal aspect of it, it started with the Rehab Act in 1973. In 2004, we have the IDEA Act, or the Individual with Disabilities in Education Improvement Act. 2008, the Higher Education Opportunity Act. And you can see just every few years, we're getting more and more in tuned and in touch with inclusion and how we are going to accommodate all these students with special needs. And there's a great infographic on the Center for Technology and Disability, and it shows the evolution of the federal disability legislation from 1973 to 2016. It also goes into great detail about how we can personalize learning environments, address multiple pathways to learning, include personal interests. There's the discussion about how students we're preparing students for jobs that don't exist yet. So we really need to draw in those personal interests, because we don't know what they're going to be doing with the language in a few years or in so many years. And so they also talk about learning networks, and then providing alternative learning environments. A lot of my students are, what I'm finding when I do reach out to the parents and discuss, what challenges they're having with the online learning, is that they left the brick and mortar schools because they weren't getting what they felt was appropriate for their child. They thought that bringing them home, doing an online learning community would be a better environment, or that they would learn better. And there's just, we're still in that kind of transition of moving from brick and mortar to the online community, and the parents aren't always as tech savvy supporting their learning at home. So we do have that gap in resources. So another point that the report made was the difference between equity and accessibility. Is that equity relates to increasing all learners' access to education opportunities that aim to remove barriers and close achievement gaps. So as I mentioned, there were students who were taken out of brick and mortar schools because they were failing, they were struggling. Their parents felt like they were not being supported. So they took them out and put them in online communities, and they weren't always quite prepared for that either. So, but they were just trying any other alternative to try to close that gap and try to support their children. Accessibility now refers to the design of the materials, and that's something that we have a little bit more control over, and how it accommodates to the individual needs of the learner. I've kind of, created this slide just to demonstrate, what not to do. So you want to use serif fonts, or fonts that are very clear, not in cursive, not, funky and different and decorative. You want to use dark fonts on light backgrounds, preferably black and white. And avoid extremely bright colors, flashing images, and so forth. You want to use one font throughout the entire site or whatever you're presenting. And you want to avoid overuse of italics, bolds, or capital letters. Also avoiding underlining words, because this can be mistaken for a navigation link by a screen reader. So, we also want to recognize that in the future, a lot of these students are going to be using other software in order to read and follow along with our lessons. I found a great checklist, and I have a link to it, and this kind of gives you another idea of what we're looking for, using text descriptions rather than links. Again, these are kind of things that I just pointed out in the previous slide. Take a moment for this short activity, and it's basically having you take either your website or a website that you are either using, maybe your school website, and just to get an idea of where we're at and where we need to be as far as being in compliance. Now, we can't expect our lessons to be perfect and completely in compliance. However, if we start moving that way, if we start moving into that direction, we'll hopefully be able to catch up with the technology, and it won't be such a shock when they say, okay, you know, your lessons are great, but you need to change everything. Parents, like I said, were bringing students out of the brick and mortar schools feeling like the accommodations were not being met, and then, you know, we think that the online virtual schools are going to be better, and we really want to make sure that it's something that, you know, that does embrace them when they do come to when they feel like the brick and mortar experience has failed them, and they come to the online community and they're finding it is still, you know, busy websites, too much information, overwhelming the students. Again, that's something that, you know, this is all encompassing, and when we talk about differentiating instruction, we're talking about that child as the whole child and the whole learning experience and environment. And as a brick and mortar teacher, I also had a website that I created for students that they could access at home. There's the Center on Technology and Disability, the Web Accessibility Initiative. There's also other ways for you to check maybe your PowerPoints and so forth, and your office documents, and rules to consider when you're creating those documents. Here, the checklist for the ADA compliance in online courses. That's a downloadable Word document that you can use to just kind of check through some of the documents as you create them. It's where we're moving in that virtual learning environment. It's something to consider and something to keep in mind as you're spending so much time creating all these resources. So moving on to part 2, the differentiation with proficiency levels. Again, we are all familiar with the ACTFL proficiency standards, am I correct? The next kind of pedagogy or framework of thinking about differentiation and proficiency levels and students with special needs, I found, is this Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. And I've just got a little bit of information on there, but it kind of lays a nice little backdrop or foundation for what we're going to be discussing. And then we'll get into the fun stuff, the creative part, you know, the scenarios, we'll have a little discussion about the badges, and then providing meaningful and encouraging feedback. Again, you know, looking at this like from a holistic point of perspective, as differentiating learning starts from the very foundation up. It's something that, you know, you just can't add on later. It's something that needs to be there from the very beginning, even from the font that you choose, as I pointed out in the beginning. So here is just a brief definition of what the Universal Design for Learning is. Again, this is also mentioned in that report, and I have a reference to the U.S. Department of Education report. So basically it is the curriculum, the goals are provide an appropriate challenge for all students. Again, that word all is going to be, you know, throughout this presentation and anything you find in differentiated instruction, all students. Materials have a flexible format. They're supporting transformation between media and multiple representations of content to support all students' learning. The methods are flexible and diverse enough to provide appropriate learning experiences, challenges, and supports for all students. And assessment is sufficiently flexible to provide accurate ongoing information that helps teachers adjust instruction and maximize learning. So the application of this would mean providing multiple means of representation, keeping accessibility in consideration again. So you're providing different ways to present the information. In elementary schools, we use a lot of manipulatives, so things that are tangible, visuals, and providing multiple means of expression. So you could be writing, creating with language, and providing multiple means of engagement, collaboration, and scaffolding. So again, this just kind of lays the backdrop of, you know, what we're going to be discussing as far as differentiating instruction and kind of trying to incorporate all those learners. I know we have very diverse learners in our classrooms. You know, your response to a prompt might be a novice low from one and then intermediate low from another. It just depends on what your virtual environment, your virtual learning and teaching environment is. Now, some of the issues that I have noticed with scenarios and prompts, it says, your teacher asks you to write about your family. Now, I know this is a really common prompt. However, a lot of the times when we ask students very personal questions, another one is describe an illness you or a family member has had recently, they start to want to use vocabulary that they're not yet prepared for. And so in our virtual learning community, we call using outside resources. We don't like to use the word cheating. So we use academic integrity infractions or using outside resources to describe when students will start to just basically use Google Translate or they are just going to look in a dictionary and it's word for word. And it is really hard to control that when a student is sitting by themselves behind their computer and learning online virtually, and trying to encourage students to just use the materials that are provided to them. It partly starts with the prompts and the scenarios that we give them. Another, describe today's cars and how cars in the future will be different. If students aren't really interested in cars or if they're not even driving yet, it's going to be kind of hard for them, and they're going to think that they need vocabulary that they don't have. When we offer or when we present scenarios and prompts like this, we're kind of asking for it. I went through some of, we keep a track of the infractions that we have with our learning community, and I went back and looked at that list, and then I looked at the list where more students were using outside resources, and then I compared it to the prompts, and I noticed that yes, they were a lot of personal ones. So again, students really want to tell you everything about, especially if they're feeling isolated in their home. They want to tell you everything about themselves and their families and their friends, and they don't always have the vocabulary for it. So we run the risk when we write very personal or ask students to speak about their personal lives, of them wanting to go out and look for outside resources to tell you exactly what's going on with them. Also, in your own words, describe a recipe you found online. This is another prompt that we've used. And, you know, there really is only certain ways to talk about how to make a macaroni and cheese or bake a cake or something. I mean, there's just, you know, only certain words and so many ways you can say it. So again, these are some prompts that I do recognize that, you know, students are more prone to use outside resources. So what are some prompts that you've used that you found successful and that students were engaged in, and in that they actually seem to encompass different levels? I know that I used a prompt one time and it just was so successful, and I could use it from kindergarten all the way up through high school. There was like a speed kind of acting out model where a student sat down in one chair and another student and the chair was a girl and a boy, and they had to think of an excuse of not going out with the other. So I changed it and I said, your language teacher has just showed up at a party. And this happens, you know, you show up at a party or you show up someplace and they think automatically, oh no, I have to speak Spanish or French or Chinese to my teacher. And they had to think of excuses on why not to talk to me, but to be polite. So again, this, you know, they could say, give me one word responses, or they could give me full sentences. And they were so excited. I had students just, you know, diving in, trying to tell me their excuse and excited to tell me an excuse on why they couldn't talk to me. So what kind of prompts or scenarios that you have found students that were excited to talk about? So even in the asynchronous environment, I noticed that students, you know, they do like to talk about animals. You know, animals are universal. Animals and music. Yes, music is something that's very universal. Traditions and different cultural expressions. Yes, food. Great, there's some great ideas. So now I'm going to take that idea and I'm going to step it up a little bit. There was an example of something called the RAFT strategy. Is anybody familiar with the RAFT strategy? The RAFT strategy, it's all about choices when we talk about differentiated instruction. And the RAFT assignment allows for learners to choose their assessment and respond to prompts that encourage them to think about different perspectives. So when we talk about intercultural communication or interculturality, I think that this is a very good strategy that would encourage or at least support that, looking at different perspectives and also, it also incorporates the idea of considering different career paths for learning another language or where we might use a language. No matter how many times I tell my students, you're going to use the language more here in the United States than you're going to use it studying abroad or when you go on out of the country. I would keep reiterating that, and then when I would survey them and I would say, okay, so, why do you think learning a language is important? They would always say, when I study abroad. So I really would like to encourage more of students to consider how they might use the language, in their community or in the United States. I know that Louisville had a large refugee and immigration population, and so I would try to bring in people, and just give and provide them with opportunities to get out into the community and notice that their language could be valuable in their very own community. So the RAFT strategy provides some choices. So the table shows in the first column, you're the role of the writer. So you kind of choose one from each. The role of the writer, who are you as the writer? So if this is a writing assignment, a presentational writing assignment, you're either going to be, let's say, a writer or a reporter or a character, an artist, a doctor, a salesperson. In the audience, who are you writing for? You're writing for yourself, maybe like a journal. Are you writing for peers, a teacher, a client, a parent, a government? So you can really see the range that you can go with this, from novice to superior if you're talking about government and things like that and opinions. And then the format, then they choose the format. Are you going to be writing a journal? Maybe an interview? Preparing for an interview? Are you going to create a cartoon? I had students create cartoons from very early on. It's a great way to incorporate that visual aspect. Sometimes if they can't express themselves, they can draw it and kind of explain it from there. Is it a critique, a video, a brochure? And then the topic, what are you writing about? Are you writing about a current issue, personal interest, a concern for the audience, whoever the audience is, or is it just informational? And here's a very more specific example. Student would like to study abroad. Okay, this is something that your high school and your college students, they might be applying to study abroad. So they might write, the audience might be an organization, the format might be an application, and the topic is the reason for wanting to study abroad. After students use the scenarios that are provided, it would be nice to see them venture out and create their own scenarios. So again, there's the real estate agent, a potential client. They could be creating a brochure or an advertisement, and the topic is to promote or it's informational. A guest who stayed at a host's home. So you're wanting to write a thank you letter to your host. And the topic is going to be that you're grateful for their generosity and kindness. And so you can see how this format can go in so many different directions and can really include so many different ranges of proficiency levels. So a badge is a distinguishing mark or emblem or sign of achievement. So this idea came to me with my I CAN statements. I started creating these lessons in these units where I'd have one overarching question, and it would be, I can plan and socialize in a party. And so everything we did in that unit was all about, how to ask questions to students, how to, our peers, how to have those interpersonal conversations, how to write out an invitation and plan it. And, so we had all these different, all this different information in that period that we brought together that covered presentational modes, interpersonal, and so forth. Now, what if we created a badge? Or what if a student had a certain interest and it wouldn't be so off the wall that they actually went into a career path that included their personal interest and the language of the language that they were learning. So this idea is that the learners design a badge based on their interests. They set the goals. They design the assessment based on their proficiency level. And again, the assessment could be using this raft format. And then hopefully that your students are starting to get as familiar as you are with the proficiency levels. And then they start to own their learning and include different modes of communication. So how fun would it be if a student could create their own badge, create their own assessment, and include the different presentational modes, and then present that to you once they're through? Again, differentiated instruction is all about going back to that UDL, providing multiple means of representation so they can get this information from different areas, using different modes and different resources, and providing multiple means of expressing what they know and expressing what they've learned. Here is an example with the badge. So we have a globe. Let's say the student just designed a globe as a badge, created their assessment by saying, okay, I'm going to create an application or a personal letter stating why I want to study abroad in the target language, and the audience is this and so forth. Again, here, and then you have at the bottom a choice. So again, that gives the student the freedom to create something and understand those proficiency levels and demonstrate their learning in a way that they feel most comfortable.